One of the stories Bastiat tells is of the broken window. A kid breaks a window, people gather around and say, well, you know, there's some good in this. There'll be work for the glazier to replace the window. That's what's seen. What's not seen is the money the store owner spends to replace the window could have been used to buy his son a pair of shoes. So after the window is replaced, the economy has the same number of windows, but one less pair of shoes. Bastiat summed it up: destruction is not profitable. The same principle applies to war. People point to all the capital and labor used to produce the materials of war and to fight the war: trucks, tanks, aircrafts, bullets, and military manpower. Isn't it great, they say, that these workers have jobs, these plants are running? That's what's seen. What's not seen is that the people and capital used in these uses could have been employed in other uses. Take World War II, which the proponents of the iron law of war consider their best evidence. In a nutshell, their evidence is this. In 1941, when America was not at war except for the last 3 weeks of the year, the unemployment rate was 9.9%. By 1944, the peak of wartime spending, the U.S. government spending in the war was a whopping 38% of GNP, and the unemployment rate was down to 1.2%. Also in 1944, real GDP was 40% higher than in 1941. That's what's seen. But where do those resources come from to make those hundreds of thousands of trucks, tens of thousands of aircraft and tank, and thousands of ships? Much of the capital and labor would have been producing cars and trucks for the domestic economy. In fact, the assembly lines in Detroit shut down. If you go on Wikipedia, you can't find production from 1943 through 44. It was so small it wasn't worth reporting. And if you doubt that, could someone please tell me the name of a 1944 model? Consider fuel. Because the government wanted to buy fuel at an artificially low price, it imposed price controls on gasoline, which of course causes a shortage, and put itself first in line. By the way, I should have known I wanted to be an economist. Other kids hated broccoli. I hated price controls. Then it issued ration cards to Americans, dramatically reducing the amount that normal Americans could buy at controlled prices. In his autobiography, the late newsman David Brinkley, who, by the way, was somewhat of a newsman compared to some of what we're hearing about today, he was a cut above, tells how he was unable to continue a serious romance during World War II because his lady friend lived in another city. He couldn't get gas, it was rationed. Spaces on their railroad were rationed to military personnel, and he had to drop the relationship. By contrast, members of Congress got X stickers, X for exempt. They could get all the gas they wanted. Lyndon Johnson was a congressman in those days. He drove home to Texas almost every weekend. Now, imagine that somehow the United States had avoided entering World War II. I don't want to talk about the consequences for the world. That's controversial, and more important, it's completely separable from the point I'm making. Millions of cars would have been produced. Millions of people would have been able to travel. People wouldn't have had meat, tires, nylon, sugar, eggs rationed. In short, by the standard measures of prosperity, Americans would have been much more prosperous. And David Brinkley would have been able to pursue his true love. I mention that last consequence not to emphasize the trivia, but in fact to do the opposite. To emphasize one of the millions of stories of the large human cost that befell even Americans whom the U.S. government did not put at risk of dying. But I certainly shouldn't leave out the human cost without mentioning the ultimate cost. 407,000 Americans who lost their lives directly because of the war. As one of my students, a U.S. military officer in my class, when we discussed this point, pointed out, the war was not good for their economy. And I want to just look behind the unemployment measures because people look at... Okay, thank you. I want to look behind the unemployment measures. How's that, Tom? Because we look at the fact that unemployment declined from 9.9 to 1.2%, but Bob Higgs has pointed out why. Something called the draft. 10 million people were drafted, and most of the other 6 million were what military manpower economists call draft-induced. So when you start with about 8 million people unemployed, it's not hard to get the unemployment rate down to about 1 million if you draft 10 million. And you can't say, based on that those people were better off. The only way economists or anyone else has of figuring out whether people are better off in a job is whether they chose the job, and they didn't get to choose. Didn't net gross national product increase? Yes, but look behind it. GNP measures output. It doesn't measure value necessarily. Those things were produced and destroyed. If that percentage of GDP had been back in, even with a lower rate of decline of the unemployment rate, virtually every American would have been better off. Now, war isn't good for the economy in the narrow sense, but also it isn't good for the economy in a wider sense. It provides the opportunity and the excuse to expand government and reduce freedom. Then once the war is over, government loses some power, but never goes back to its earlier size. Take World War I, please. During the war, Woodrow Wilson nationalized railroads. After the war ended, railroads were returned to the original owners, but with a heavy degree of regulation on top. This regulation didn't end until Congress and President Carter ended it in 1980. In 1916, the year before America's entry into the war, the top marginal tax rate on Americans was 15%, and only a few high-income Americans paid it. In 1917, the year the United States entered the war, the top rate shot up to 67%. By 1918, it had hit 77%. And the heroic Secretary of the Treasury, Andrew Mellon, through the 1920s under Republican administrations, cut the rates drastically, but never again did the top rate go under 25%. And Higgs points out that although we think of prohibition as beginning with the Volstead Act, it actually started with the Lever Act of 1917. How could the government justify imposing price controls on wheat without then dictating how wheat was to be used? So they dictated that none of these foodstuffs were to be used in producing alcohol. It gave people a little taste before the fact of prohibition. Prohibition also brought rent controls, which took years to disappear until after the war ended. And also, of course, it brought the most extreme price control of all, along with forced sales, that is, the military draft. Conscription gave the government the power to pay less than a market wage by giving it the power to put young men in prison for not signing up. The good news is that conscription ended after the war ended. The bad news is that it softened up the country for its reintroduction in 1940. Civil liberties also took a hit during World War I, especially free speech. One of the most famous cases was that of one of Woodrow Wilson's political competitors, Eugene V. Debs. Wilson had run against him for president in 1912. Debs gave a speech in June 1918 in which he denounced World War I and the draft. Interestingly, he did not go to prison until after the war ended, and Wilson refused to commute his sentence. On Christmas Day 1921, in his first year of office, Warren Harding, that guy we're supposed to think of as one of the worst presidents, commuted the Debs sentence and set him free. I had an argument with Lou Rockwell yesterday about whether Harding was the best president or only the fourth best. To put the Wilson administration's action in perspective, it would be like George Bush putting Pat Buchanan in prison, or if Al Gore had become president in 2001, Al Gore putting Ralph Nader in prison. Again, the damage was long-term because the Supreme Court in Schenck v. United States, which upheld the World War I violations of free speech, corrupted basic legal thinking. The court voted 9-0 to uphold the Espionage Act's restrictions on free speech. Indeed, it was in the Schenck decision that Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes made his famous statement that, quote, "The most stringent protection of free speech would not protect a man in falsely shouting fire in a theater." Great line, but Holmes never connected it with the case at hand.